Are we online?
Yep.
Oh, sweet. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the semi-finals of the 2016 NTU Pro-Am Championship. Right. It's our honor to have with us four really good teams in the semi-final with, in opening government, the European Schools Champion and Schlep. In opening opposition, we have the Ashish Kumar Fanklub. In closing government, we have Happiness. And in closing opposition, we have NTU-B. The judges for today are Ms. Pratana from the Education Corps, Olivia, and yours truly, Bob. Without further ado, may we now invite the Prime Minister to open the debate on behalf of the opening government here.
Mr. Speaker, in the developing world, we realize that countries need money urgently. We realize this money is required to set up infrastructure to make sure that the country can develop at a quicker rate. But we realize for economies to grow, you need certain prerequisites. You need decent services, you need sanitation, you need some elements of law and order. But we realize that developing countries, especially transition economies, which are moving from subsistence agriculture to more service-based industries, don't have that kind of resources or money to go about dealing with setting up these resources, right? Furthermore, they don't have the kind of tax base that they could leverage in terms of raising the funds they need to set up systems that could help their country develop further. And we realize in those circumstances, social impact bonds, or rather private investing to solve social problems is the best way to deal with this. So I will do a few things in this debate. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why governments should take up private bonds. Secondly, why governments will eventually turn money and turn a profit on this. Thirdly, why it's in the best interest for private organizations to join in. And lastly, why private organizations are the only way we should be going about dealing with this. So these are the four things I want to cover. The first point, for what is it for the government, right? So how does the social impact bond or private investing work? Government is borrowing money with a promise from private investors that they're going to build something, that they're going to do something, especially with a goal in mind, goals being that of a social change, maybe things like sanitation, maybe setting up healthcare, hospitals, or those kind of things. No, thank you. So there's not a generic way of funding. But once they've set these systems up and are making a profit on them, these private investors can then be paid back with some plus and interest. And we think that there's a level of commitment that's required when you're taking money from a private ownership, from a private owner, given that countries usually default on their debt all the time. We think that private ownership is a slightly different way of ownership systems that allow us to compel countries to follow through with their promises in terms of setting up a hospital, for instance, right? Now we think that this pre-commitment is an efficient use, no thank you, is an efficient use of the money that's put in. So maybe alignments are certainly land development goal, for instance. And I want to share the information. So when they are able to align themselves and investors see this as something that's clearly laid out, they are best able to signal to the markets as well that, yeah, maybe your country isn't able to borrow now, but it's a good sign that if you follow through with your promises, this will lead to maybe more investment in the future. But yes.
Just to clarify, the return on this investment is determined by how well you deliver these social outcomes. Right?
Yes, right. So the second point that I want to talk about eventually will be on how governments raise interest. And while there are other alternatives in terms of raising money, we think that the best way that you could raise money would be if you achieve your social outcomes. Because let's talk about how these bonds usually work. Bonds are not issued every year, every 2 years. These bonds are usually long-term. No, thank you. If these bonds are long-term, there are interest rates that are levied on it. And if you don't follow through on your promises, these interest rates usually go up. You have to issue new debt. And this usually proves that you haven't been following through on your promises. But let's say you did. Let's say that within the cycle of a bond period, you managed to deliver on your promises. Not only would you have done well enough to transition from where you were to where you eventually aim to be, that transition will mean that you're best positioned to now be actually turning a profit on the services or the systems that you've now set up, which means that you're best able to pay back on interest or on the loans that you've taken. And we think that's a great thing for countries that are trying to develop and trying to move quickly within the system and structures that they've set up. We think that furthermore, democracies can't hide behind generic issues or discussion topics. because these are very specific issues that you're punished for if you don't follow through with them. This becomes a fact because it's through a private investor as opposed to a generic voter base that votes of like that is taxed for a multitude of reasons. The fact that you borrow money for a particular cause means that if you don't deliver, you're punished for it equally and quite obviously, right? Third thing, who are these stakeholders and why are these stakeholders useful? So these stakeholders are private stakeholders, people who have a lot of capital, political capital as well as literal capital, and these connections. We think that this is important that these people play a role, because if they don't see the investment bearing any fruit, no thank you, then they can put the kind of political pressure that's required to make sure that the investment sees the end of the day. This is important because if countries are trying to take money and make sure that they're using them well, you want someone who can offer the kind of external check and validation in terms of accountability, that the money is being used for the right causes and is being used effectively and efficiently. We realize that governments are not averse to keeping an eye on public services, like in terms of how much money they're spending, and they usually try to check for this in terms of corruption, in terms of resource allocation, so on and so forth. We think that this is going to be primarily the case when it comes to private investments as well, more specifically with private investments, because you are looking at a particular cause that private investors might want to invest in, and you have to deal with those cases explicitly. But the last thing that we think is the most important thing as to why private investing is the best and the only way to go about dealing with this is in terms of how resource allocation works. We think that instead of private investors hijacking the way the government has been approaching social impact issues, we think that, I'll take it in a moment, we think that the sum total of the pie that's made available in terms of the amount of money that's available in order to establish certain services or in order to establish that certain provisions are made means that you can do more things in a better manner. Yes?
Is your return on investment going to be more or less lucrative than existing sovereign bonds?
We think we're going to be doing a better job when it comes to our system as compared to a sovereign bond. We think that a sovereign bond usually comes when it comes to two countries or people within a country talking to each other. We think private investors should take care of this in a better manner. But going back to my argument, so we think the sum total of pie increases, right? So for instance, we've had some kind of budget that's allocated, and maybe you want to use it for sanitation, and sanitation takes up a small portion of it. As opposed to a private investor coming in and saying, you know what, I really care for sanitation. I want this amount of money, like these many $1 million, to be spent fixing sanitation in these areas of the country. We think that instead of hijacking or shifting focus from one issue to the other, we're best able to deal with a particular issue in a better manner because funds are not being reallocated, but rather more funds are being made available to certain issues. And we think that's a good thing. But the last thing that I want to talk about is what happens when private investors come in. Private investors have a vested interest to make services profitable and to make a country more sustainable because they put in their own money into it and they want the money back. If they want the money back, they have a vested interest to make sure that these systems that are set up are not tokenistic systems that just exist for existence sake, but rather systems that could self-serve themselves or be self-sustainable in the long run. This means that the countries and the systems that are now set up are great systems as opposed to systems from sovereign bonds or other alternate means of funding that might not achieve a similar end. For all these reasons, please stand for opening government.
Thank you very much to the Prime Minister for his speech. May we now invite the Leader of the Opposition to begin his case, or her case. Her case for the opening opposition. Here.
Oh, is it?
There should not have been.
The sound's a bit off.
They should not have been captured in camera.
Really? They didn't see it on the line.
Yeah, we really touch it.
What Thai government does not realize today is that when you have these bonds that you sell to these private investors, that your dividends necessarily need to be extremely high in order for these people to even invest in you in the first place. This means that social problems which would be solved, right, and would be invested in, would necessarily to be extremely lucrative. And these problems which need to be extremely lucrative in order to even get investment in the first place. This means that only a certain type of social problems will be dealt with, while the rest of them will be completely have a lack of funds. And this is why we think that social problems will not be solved at all on their side. So what is the counter model that we bring to you? We think that firstly, we have three ways of increasing funding for the government, right, to deal with social problems. Firstly, we think that we can completely increase taxation when governments are in deficit. We're perfectly fine with issuance of government standard bonds as well to people. Secondly, we think international development aid is perfectly fine as well. We're okay with NTUs, for example, like habitats for things to come in to like help these countries. For example, even government transfers of wealth such as US development aid. Thirdly, we're really fine with countries, companies, even donating as well as what I've already done. No, thank you, sir. It's how they really try to fulfill that corporate social responsibility. We think that this really exists currently. We think that these are great ways to help fund the government. So let's let's talk about what exactly that side government has brought us today, right? Firstly, the first thing that they're trying to tell us is how they're going to help developing countries. The main problem that identifies that developing countries fundamentally lack money, and money is the best way to solve their problem. Let's break that link. Firstly, we don't think that the lack of money is the biggest problem that developing countries face. In fact, we think that there's enough money and development aid already poured into these countries in the first place. The reason why problems aren't solved is because all this money are being channeled towards things such as trying to get to administration levels, get to corrupt governments, getting into pockets of people who do not want this money to even help solve social problems in the first place. This means that the problem isn't about the amount of money, but it's about how we can help to change this government and nature of this government. The fact is, pouring more money into these pieces isn't necessarily going to change the problem like they try to solve it. This means that the problem is not clear exactly how on the outside, by increasing the pie, right, there's a really bad way to somehow solve the problems any better on the outside. And so second, they try to tell us about how people identify this point, about how we ask them if the dividends from these private bonds, right, will be any higher than sovereign bonds. The fact is that by having their policy, right, sovereign bonds not necessarily to be extremely high dividends as well. They have to yield extremely high profits in order for these companies to even invest in the first place. This means that governments, especially developing countries, who are in extremely huge debt, right, and with a low level of return, will not need to increase the dividends extremely high level so the companies will be held in the first place. No, thank you, sir. This means that these developing countries will be in far less state than they currently are. I think that is a terrible idea. No, thank you, sir. So now moving on to our positive case, right? Let's talk about what are the reasons that we think that using private investor money is terrible. Firstly, we think that private investments discourages and conflicts with the fundamental idea of altruism. No, thank you, sir. This means that let's talk about our companies who are already altruistic and would have been donating money already in the current state. So we think that these people in these countries, in these companies, with their current model, we mean that these companies would invest to increase their public image or return. Like for example, Phyllis Morris, who have been investing millions of dollars in Cambodia to help with schools and build roads. I think that companies like that, firstly, will redirect their money to take the money that would otherwise have going to be donated and not going to be used as invested for profit margins. With no thank you, sir. I think this is terrible because secondly, it means that it reduces the amount of money that would otherwise went to the government. As now the government has to pay dividends to these companies, would otherwise have donated this money completely. This is why we think that this is terrible, right? Secondly, Jesus, we think that companies talk about companies who are not altruistic, as most of them are. We think that what this means is that create a perverse incentives for private investors only invest in lucrative social problems that have the most dividends to it. This means, to give you an example, no thank you, sir, how they will not sponsor enormous school building projects, for example, in places that are not known to the international community but actually need these sponsored goals. They will be investing in things like, for example, in public transport in Manila. Things like far more lucrative and will yield far more profits on their side. No, thank you, sir. This is why we think that this is bad because firstly, these problems, like for example, that Manila, really have had enough political will to be able to solve by the governments in themselves. The problems that we really need to face now, social problems, are problems that otherwise do not have enough political will and do not have enough support by the public to channel government funding into changing these problems. This is why we think that we need these private investors to they need this enough money to go there and work with them. We don't think that asking private investors will help this problem. Secondly, we think that, well, thank you, sir, that even if they donate to unprofitable social problems, I think that at the end of the day, these companies will still demand dividends from the governments because of financial investors in the first place. So this simply means that we're shifting the tax burden this is the most important point. It's harder for governments to increase taxes as public perceive that there's always alternative to these government funds in this social, in this corporate funding structure. And why is this so? I think the political opponents in the public will fundamentally make a lot of noise on the economic government about how that there's always this alternative source of revenue that you can use to attack social problems. So why are we increasing taxation rates, right? I think that's terrible. This causes an over-reliance on the private sponsorship of public projects. This means that in time when governments most need to invest and need to have the most flexible and spending, right? When government coffers are going to be empty and are going to be unable to do this, there's a lot of times where we do investments such as economic recessions, right? When the markets are flagging. The problem is that the only source of substantial income in this kind will come from private companies. And governments themselves are unable to take these funds as they would like and respond, right? Most importantly, this means that companies, right, will not necessarily want to invest in these social programs, especially during times of economic recession, which is when the markets are flagging, which is when demand of these companies are not working well, profit markets are higher. This means that investment won't come in times when society most needs it. And it also means that it creates a paradox, right? That in times where these interventions move needed, governments necessarily won't have the funding to tackle these social problems. I think that this is a terrible idea. Lastly, let's talk about very quickly around how governments will push the development for the generation. Where is such that dividends, right, that governments have sold these bonds to these companies will be demanded to be paid and future generations, for example, 20 years, 30 years down the road. This means that individuals who never consented to it now have the moral implications to have to pay these things, which is actually immoral because these people never consented to selling these bonds in the first place. For all these reasons, they don't tackle social problems, they worsen developing countries, all of them very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much to the leader of the opposition, DPM. Take it away. You're here.
Opening government delivers two things. The first thing we deliver is a larger economic pie and a larger sum total political capital to solve social problems and help everyone. The second thing we do, which is the second part of the speech, is going to be why we create a better mechanism to check on the progress of governments that are probably well-meaning, but especially in developing countries, that the focus and checks and balances in the public sphere to ensure that they actually deliver these policies. Number one, who raises the pie of resources we have in development? And the outcome tells you why, especially in developing countries, it is most likely that things like sanitation will not be well done. It is crucial that we get resources to dig. It's okay we pay a dividend in English accounts. Obviously, that's a burden which it stands for. The reason it is okay is because you need a seed amount of capital to build also the social capital, like people get educated, like people having a good healthcare systems so that they can work in crowded conditions without being afraid of anything. Falling ill all the time and ensuring that these things attract businesses, manufacturing, and so on and so forth. We are okay with paying these dividends because we put ourselves in a better position economically to pay them back 10, 20 years down the line. It is access to capital that is crucial. The other side says there are alternatives. Number one, that we raise taxes. Look, I'm going to told you why tax-based, a rural-based economy, which has been farming for the last 40 years, is not likely to be big and allow you to have this startup. They said NGOs and international organizations. NGOs say a fraction of the world capital is freaking tiny, right? Like, I don't care how habitats or anything is going to be able to give countries that have the amount of money they need to change the world. Finally, there's international aid. Sure, international organizations have money, but they have the wrong incentives. They have political incentives that are often tied to things like the Washington Consensus to increase trade, because those are things that are politically good for those leaders and for those economies. It means you get a mismatch of incentives to screw over these economies instead of ensuring, as we'll tell you in a bit, why they're in a good position to pay this debt back 20 years down the line. So, those alternatives don't work, chimneys become better. The last thing they said was, donations. Where do they come from? I don't see why companies have any incentive to make donations to the state. That's why we have to tax them. I mean, tax havens, guys, we've been doing this for so long. If they want to make donations, they have not done this stuff. So it's unclear where this large sum of capital is going to come from, beyond the catchwords of team opposition. So there are no alternatives on their side. Financially, it is our side that gives countries a far larger economic base in which to build their countries. Now, they give a couple of small things. They say that now governments and private investors will only invest in known areas. right? And I think the market takes care of this, because presumably then, the unknown areas have higher profit potential that is unrealized. And the dividends we're likely to get on those areas, if no one else is going there, is going to be higher. So someone's going to say, having done my research, I now know that even though everyone's going for, say, this part of the Philippines, there's actually somewhere in Cebu City or something, there's a different part of the country, which is actually paying a pretty good price, and I'm going to invest there because I think there's a certainty of profit in the next 20 years. I think the market corrects this. Last thing they say is that it's harder to raise taxes. Okay, I'm not sure why this is de facto a bad thing, because sometimes raising taxes can be bad, no matter which stage of development you're at. And I think it's up to governments to then, even if they're somewhat accountable to people, to make a choice. Whether the political cost of raising taxes weigh out against the future cost of having to pay this back in 10 to 20 years. And particularly in cases like recessions, where raising taxes might be a bad thing. Because raising taxes in a recession means people have less money in their pocket, making the recession worse. So I still don't see how this argument of opposition is a de facto bad thing. But thank you, there some scenarios which is a bad thing. It's not clear that it always is. The final contribution I want to make here is that beyond expanding the pool of financial capital, I think we also expand the pool of political capital. This argument applies to developing democracies as well. And the point of the state is taking tax money that has literally been taken off public individuals' pockets, like as in the role as a citizen. It is very easy to say this money should be coming back to me and me alone. And politically, it's very hard to galvanize support for minorities. For example, Igbo communities in parts of the US, like Virginia, who are minorities often live in ghettos, but it's very hard to justify, given that there's such a small part of this population, why tax money should flow into them. It's very easy to read the shout, thank you, American dollars for American interests. And the point is a profit opportunity, the money is not coming literally from the pockets of the American taxpayer, but from someone who mutually consents to make this deal. It's far easier for the government to justify the program they're going to use to help these individuals. Because the rhetoric is now, I'm not taking this money, having expanded the economic pie, the money is coming from someone else, and as a result, we should do this because it's the morally right thing to do. So, political capital also increases on our side when you make parts of the government transaction for social services one that is in the private market. It's a good thing for minorities as well. More economic resources, more political resources. Part 2 of this speech is going to be about which I create a better check on progress. I think ultimately there are 3 mechanisms here. The first mechanism is that the interest rate or the dividend or the price, whatever you want to call it, signals to the market constantly in a dynamic system how well a government is doing in delivering on the conditions of that bond. So governments, when they issue this bond, to make it unlike any other bond, try and make it more specific. They don't just say, here's sovereign debt. They say, this debt is tied to a roadmap of action. Why do they give this information? Because if they give this information and they say, my roadmap is 5 hospitals in the next 2 years, a fully functioning system in the next 10 years, and by 20 years I will privatize this and start running it for profit. That information is what gives certainty to investors, which in turn lowers the price we pay. So you try and give as much information and stick to that information roadmap, because not doing so means that the next bond you issue is going to, the price is going to be really high. People don't trust you anymore to deliver on your promises. That information signaling is an incredibly good one. Even if dividend is high, fine with that. Second thing we do is we create sector specificity. Presumably, these bonds are not for social services in general. They are for social services tied to specific issues. Sanitation, healthcare, geographical specificity is often included. It means that given you have different prices now, people around the world, as well as people in those places, can point to a very convenient metric as ascertained by information from the international community about how well their government is doing. They can now say, sure, you'll be doing well on this issue, but this one, the price of the bonds for healthcare, it is insanely high. And they can then mobilize efforts to focus on those issues of domestic politics. The last thing I would say is that this is comparatively better than the IMF or democracy. The IMF doesn't work because I told you they're private international actors have their own private incentives. Even in a democracy, there's a huge time lag, right? There's a not time lag, I'm sorry, it's very short. You want to one win the next election. And so you pour lots of public funds into making social services really good right before the election. See last year. The difference is that when you care about whether the government is going to pay you back at the end of your bond, your interest as a private investor, the way you use your political capital to lobby local governments, to lobby anti-corruption movements, does not care about the next election in 3 years. It cares about the state of this government as it persists in the next 20. You care about this beyond political parties. You care about the health of this government and its fiscal position in the way it is spending its money in developing these resources. That interest is a far better interest than any alternative I think opposition can provide. To the extent that you need to provide financial capital and also have most political capital, we think that political capital is going to be used in a good way to ensure the governments are responsible beyond electoral cycles and over the duration of these very long bonds. On our side, I think we increase the pie. I think it makes it easier for developing countries to create lasting change. I also think it creates the right incentives for these comparatively better than anything they found.
Right. Thank you very much to the Deputy Prime Minister for the speech. Now we may invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue the case. For the Opposition bench, here.
Mr. Speaker, if a government is poor or insolvent, the dividends on private investment will necessarily need to be high, because companies will rather invest in stable regimes as opposed to the kinds of countries that aren't poor. This means that in countries which most need the money as characterized by KM, opening government is mortgaging a country's future in order to pay for the present. I'm going to talk to you about three things. One, does more money equal more good? Two, do we have an alternative? And three, on information security. One, does more money equal more good? First, I have to point out, Mr. Speaker, that some countries exist where throwing more money at the problem won't solve everything. I point to you for the problem with regard to vaccinations in Saharan Africa, where private investment from GlaxoSmithKline failed to register any increase in vaccination rate. So I put to you that in this class of countries, if your economic pie is big badly, the increase in size won't solve anything. But there's another class of countries where money today means insolvency tomorrow. There are fundamental problems with these states with regard to how reform problems of balance of payments. And we think that these countries need to attract investors by issuing lucrative bonds which will pay out dividends maybe 10, 20, or 30 years later. And this leads to three critical problems with regard to economic development. First of all, it creates political incentives to engage in barrel expenditure to purchase political support by encouraging clientism between politicians and corporations. By, for instance, the government issuing bonds with extremely high dividends at the point at which a national election is coming up to ensure they have lots and lots of money, so I can spend on lots and lots of things for my people. That's exactly the kind of model that the Take talks to you about incentives of democracy that it allows political parties to abuse. Second key problem. This creates a secondary bottleneck down the road. Now, hospitals are built on their side, but now they have no money to build universities to train the doctors because they have to pay off the dividends. Roads may now be built, but they have no money to attract MNCs to invest in your site 10 years later. Now, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, but then can people invest more, which is my third problem. The third problem is that this creates cyclical dependence on private investment to keep borrowing to finance social outcomes, which in turn leads to more debt, which in turn leads to higher dividends and to attract investors, which actually creates a cyclical spiral into debt dependency. So we think that in these countries, we think it's terrible, right? They claim that more money always equates to more. No. Okay, second, do we have an alternative?
Inflation.
We gave you three alternatives. One on tax, two on corporate social responsibility, and three on NGOs. But before I even go into it, I want to point out, Mr. Chair, that we do have an alternative. It's called the status quo. We'd rather do some harm than do more harm. The entire stance is higher. So first, on tax, we think that the problem is not what our government in this country is a low tax base, because the cost of a government project in a developing country is still lower on a PPP basis than in developed countries. To build a road or a train station in Manila is cheaper than to build a road or a train station in Singapore. So even though the relative amount of tax I can make in Manila is lower than the relative amount of tax I can make in Singapore, but on a relative basis, the real government is still like affordable for these governments. But before I go on, yes.
I don't think on comparisons between developed and developing countries. Our point is that when you're starting at the absolute bottom, even denominated in your own dollars, it's not like you have that much to start with, because most of the trade that happens is in low value products like food.
Yeah, but if a very low base, then the project that will create the most job outcomes also have to be extremely cheap. For instance, like building dirt roads to ensure access from the village to the city center, like Kibali. So we disagree entirely that even in the countries that do characterize, governments have no resources to ensure optimal social outcome. No thanks. It's very disingenuous that way. So we think that as your tax, we are able to do it. Now, I will point out, Mr. Chair, that on their side it's worse, because governments and political parties on both sides of the aisle have no incentive to raise taxes, because the political proposition that always point out there is a convenient alternative of attracting private investment, which therefore creates that toxic dependency on leveraging on private investment, that which therefore creates that kind of problem that I've been talking about in this first place. So we think they create a self-governing policy with regard to elect tax money. Second, on corporate social responsibility. Now, teach us to rubbish this idea, but we think it's important, because corporate social responsibility creates an incentive for companies not just to invest in projects that have the most likelihood of return or the most likelihood of giving them money, but other projects that make them see the best, which means that companies are likely to invest in projects which may benefit a small number of people people in a very significant point they may lose money on because it benefits their brand name. That's why that's talk to you about Philip Morris building houses in Cambodia. Even though it may not be very profitable, even though dollars will not be able to issue bonds on the basis of that, we think it still benefits a significant number of people that the free market fails to recognize. So we think it's bad that in their alternative, the money that will otherwise have been devoted to CSR now goes to projects that government dictate to them based on whatever bonds the governments are issuing. So last issue of NTU. Now we think NTUs do a great job and we think that they can supplement the first group of alternatives that I talked about. So now on this idea of information signaling. Text told us that bond returns provide signals to companies to invest because high returns on investment indicates the government is doing a good job. Our alternative, democracy. Text tells us that democracy doesn't work as an alternative, no thank you, because of issues of short-termism and people encouraging comfortable spending. First of all, people hold governments in check based on their private interests. It is not clear why companies which seek profit, even if socially suboptimal, should be prioritized over a mass of people who most want those infrastructure built in those villages. So we think that the agency of the ability to decide where that money is spent should be put entirely in the hands of the individual voter rather than be put in the hands of the company. Then it told us something about the long-term ramifications of this policy. The companies are more able to look at whether or not a government is able to be solvent in the long run. No, not really, right? Very often, what a company could do is that invest in you and I put in a principal amount in purchasing your bonds, reap the dividends after 10 years, pull out of the country, irrespective of how I'm going to think it's going to be successful 20 or 30 years down the road. So we don't think that this kind of investment flow is necessarily going to be sustainable or have a long-run outcome return in mind. So we disagree that companies necessarily have some kind of long-run interest in receiving that kind of significant information through the sale of such social service. But finally, we argue, Mr. Chair, that when it comes to democracy, when it comes to incentives of a company entering a country and financing investment, at the point at which you monetize social services, you encourage the suboptimal distribution of said resources. Because companies are only ever going to want to focus on the lower-hanging fruit, things that governments will already be more or less able to be equipped to deal with. For all these reasons, I'm incredibly proud to be an opening opposition.
Yeah. Thank you very much to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. May we now invite the Member of Government to start the debate for the closing House and the closing Government.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, yet again in this tournament, I'm going to bring you two things in extension. The first is context. What this debate is actually about. Second thing is mechanism. And I'm going to do this again because I've always been told base, the context, and the mechanism. So it's a good thing to do an extension, I'd say. So I'm going to talk about the context first. And how to explain the context? I'm going to show you why a lot of the stuff which open opposition talks about isn't actually that relevant to the real context of which this happens. So, context. We believe that governments today face increasingly complex problems. It might be academics, it might be financing, or prison reform. In order for you to solve these complex problems, you need innovative solutions. In other words, you need to undertake very risky pilot projects, which might or might not work. The problem we see today in every economy, developed or developing, all the way from the UK to Somalia, is that no government wants to spend its own taxpayer money on a pilot scheme which is risky and might not succeed. The crucial thing social impact bonds do is that it allows for that risk of failure to be borne by the private sector. So if things go badly, the government learns and we don't waste any taxpayers' money. So what actually is a social impact bond and how does it work? The government wants to fund a certain innovative scheme, right? Let's say a certain prison rehabilitation scheme. It invites the private sector to lend it money so that it can do this. However, if let's say the recidivism rates 6 years after the scheme is ended, these people are still committing crimes, does not go down, then you will not be paid that money in the private sector. This means that it's not the government which bears the risk of failure, it's the private sector which bears the risk of failure. Why is this crucial? Because the governments are using taxpayer money. The political logic which says you have wasted taxpayer money on a group which is unpopular and on a scheme which fails is utterly toxic to governments. Governments are paralyzed in the status quo by the lack of innovation. And social impact bonds allow for the funding of all kinds of schemes because the private sector has a much greater risk appetite. I'll give you a couple of examples. First, we can just look at things which is innovative and untested, right? A good example is restorative justice conferencing in the prison system in the United Kingdom, which was funded exclusively through social impact bonds. What does that actually do? It allows for violent criminals to meet their victims and basically talk to them and apologize to them, right? It's a model pioneered in New Zealand.
Now, the government couldn't use their own taxpayer money to do this, because like the Daily Mail will go, government is paying for prisoners to get out early, right? There's a risk that it would fail. However, it succeeded. It turns out recidivism rates went down. The private sector made a lot of money, and now they're expanding that scheme. But that solution was only made possible because the private sector came in. Secondly, if you look at emergency or prevention schemes, the problem with many government prevention schemes is that the thing hasn't actually happened yet. You're often unsure what the optimal outcome is, right? So governments are often stymied by the lack of certainty about how they're going to prevent, say, epidemics. You don't know what the vector is, you don't know whether it's about changing people's actions, relocating populations, or increasing sanitation. They're not sure. How do you create a fund to undertake these sorts of schemes? Yet again, social impact bonds, right? And bringing on social impact bonds that because the private sector wants to make money, and to make money, they need to achieve positive outcomes, right? Otherwise, they don't get that return. All the money tends to flow naturally towards those government proposals which the private sector thinks will actually result in beneficial social outcomes. So the market naturally selects between the more and less effective social schemes which the government has put on the table and funds those which are the best, right? Also, right, another benefit is that the private sector ideas percolate into the public sector because of the fact that these companies are therefore mistaken in success, are willing to, let's say, not be so guarded about their own tactics and their own innovation. Good example is, again, in the UK prison sector, what happens is that certain parole boards are now letting prisoners go on internship during the parole period. This is an idea which came from the private sector because of the social impact bond scheme as well. So we have all these innovative solutions coming. They only happen because the government's not bearing the risk. It's the private sector, and these things have helped people's lives, right? Now let's look at what they tell us in opening opposition. The first thing they tell us is that, we get more money via tax, bonds, aid. But we realize, if we're talking about innovation, the problem is not lack of money. The problem is that no matter how much money the government would have had, it would not have wanted to spend its own money on these risky, innovative things to begin with. The problem is not about the size of the pie, it's about how we choose to spend it. Then it's what about lucrative social problems? Here's the thing, right? It depends on what your definition of social success is. What actually happens in the real world of social impact bonds is the government says, let's say you're trying to pioneer a new school system, right? Like a cooperative school where students get to choose their curriculum. The government says, okay, whether you get paid back interest depends on whether or not these students do well in the national examinations or recidivism rates. Now, none of that changes based on where the school is and how sensitive the project looks. So it's time to concrete social outcomes. So again, that was bizarrely irrelevant. Yeah, go for it.
The failure of moonshot investments will still be indirectly transferred to the taxpayer in form of higher contract services for things like prison management.
Well, but these aren't moonshot things. These are like crazy, wild ideas with zero chance of success, right? That things is like a 30 or 40% chance of failure, proportions which are frankly very acceptable towards the private sector, but utterly anathema to government. It's not that these are wild moonshot projects. It's that the government is really, really, really risk-averse and to say what's crime tested, even if it's pretty bad. That means that's always going to be really hard to raise taxes because people will say, wait a minute, why do you pay taxes when you get it from the private sector? The whole point is that funding is not going to things which have been funded via taxes in the very first place, right? Lastly, is well, the country is poor and you're going to issue these things, and the dividends will be really high, so you'll go bankrupt. That seems to be an argument against issuing all bonds, not just like social sector bonds, right? So no government to borrow to spend on anything ever, even if it's just a private citizen getting. That's pretty strange. In any case, this is not the day it falls center except like Venezuela type borrowing, right? Or Argentina type borrowing, which is falls on like the IMF. So I think that was again too extreme. Let's not talk about transparency and measuring. We see that in status quo, there are two very dangerous trends within governments. First is privatization, and the second is a lack of so-called companies engaging in corporate social responsibility, which is by and large actually fake. Right? Let's talk about privatization. The problem with privatization, and again, with the prison system, is the government just pays the company to do the thing for it, right? And what you get paid based on, it's not tied to any positive social outcome. So what happens in America, private prisons, is that they actively screw over the lives of prisoners. So they'll go out with long time and go back to the prison system because that's what gets them money. But when you tie payment to positive social outcomes, you turn around this greatest risk of privatization that converts incentives to increase social problems. In terms of corporate social responsibility, it's funny that Chin says this will take over CSR because everyone will want to run these areas. That's great, because you know what? Corporate social responsibility is a bloody lie, right? Because you're just wasting money, so companies spend very little money on it. It's like, all our company mugs are made sustainably. Or like, oh, we support fair trade. That would happen balance because they just use their income, right? Companies support these things which look good. The reason why they do this is they do not want to put in serious cash because there's nothing in it for them. Compared to social impact bonds where there is something in it for them. And it's good if corporate social responsibility stops and we start getting money from actual schemes which help actual lives with actual measurable results. And so all these reasons that we're very proud to stand in government.
Thank you very much, member of the government. We now invite member of the opposition to start the case for closing opposition. Here.
Madam Speaker, we understand that taking risky projects and doing innovation is important. We're going to prove to you that on the comparative, it's easier for governments to go ahead and take risky projects than private investors. Right? Because often even private investors care about the return on that investment. Once projects start failing, they're unlikely to keep on investing in these sorts of things. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why governments are better actors and often private investors don't care about social need in these cases. Secondly, how a constant focus on delivering outcomes, as I talked about, the government said, it acts as a dynamic signal to these markets. This can actually lead to a bad prioritization of social policy. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about how only causes which can be quantified or tangibly measured, only those causes are funded, and a lot of the other causes are no longer funded and no investment actually goes there. Firstly, most of my rebuttal will be integrated. Firstly, why are governments then better actors than private investors? Right? When you taking money from private investors, you're often beholden to these investors, and often the causes that these investors want to fund are priorities. We think that the fact that governments are often elected by people, they are often catered to a broader set of individuals. They often take the needs of a larger number of people into account. Compare that to a private investor who is only beholden to maximizing profits or maximizing share prices. When prioritizing causes, we think they're likely to care about the return on investment than actually helping these places. So we think that the money does not always go into places that need it the most. So we think it skews the causes in which the money is channeled into. So when we talk about the largest economic, that they get the largest economic pie, it's unclear why this largest economic pie is actually targeted towards the poorest areas, or not. For example, we think it's likely to go into areas where there is some sort of existing infrastructure already, rather than where you have built infrastructure from the ground up. Because these are the places where the investment is likely to be return. So we think, even on your side of the house, even if you get more investment, we think it's only going to be targeted towards places which are often likely to lead to return on that investment rather than places which need it the most. So we think, under this circumstance, governments have a better incentive to channel this money into places that need it the most, and where the social impact of that money is maximized. So even if we assume that alternatives like debt, alternatives like taxation lead to lesser amount of money, the fact that they are often channeled better and are not kept at the winnings of these private investors are actually good. So when they talk about minorities, and we think, how do you convince private investors invest in these areas, given that often your return on investment in these communities is likely to be far lower, and the amount of profit you can make is also likely to be lower. So we think, on the comparative, governments have a better incentive to invest in these areas. Secondly, we think often cost cutting can also be problematic in these instances, right? The fact that when they give the example of private prisons and how they are terrible, we think the same thing is likely to happen on your side of the house, right? When you build a hospital and when you have to constantly make profit on that, you're likely to reduce the quality of those hospitals or quality of these prisons. When they talk about rehabilitative programs, we think they're unlikely to happen on your side of the house when you take money from a private investor, because on your side of the house, these are often uncertain investments. You have a pressure to cut costs. So we think, on the comparative, governments again are far more likely to invest in things like rehabilitative programs when you compare that to investment for private prisons. So we think that even then, this is extremely worse on your side. Before I go on.
We told you it is politically easier to help minorities because A, the majority of these funds, and B, the majority of the initial funds, startup funds, come from the private sector as opposed to the taxpayers' pocket. Can you tell us why that's a bad thing?
Right. So you also have, analyze this from the perspective of a private investor, right? So we don't think private investors necessarily have an incentive to go into, let's say, the poorest areas, or where you have to make infrastructure from the ground up, because the amount of profit you make in these areas is going to be lesser than the areas, for example, where there's already some sort of existing infrastructure, where you don't have to make those fixed cost investments. We think on the comparative, then governments have a greater incentive, because they're not simply beholden to this
Information.
short-term profit, or the fact that they constantly have delivered outcomes. How does this focus on delivering outcomes be bad? They talked about how constant delivery is a dynamic signal to the market about how these governments are performing. This means there is a massive pressure on these governments to deliver short-term outcomes. They are constantly have to convince investors that our government is doing well. We think this can be bad because often social outcomes do not deliver short-term outcomes. For example, if you're tackling crime, to deliver short-term outcomes, you will actually practice policies like broken window policing or throwing vulnerable individuals into prison, right? Because you have to convince people outside and signal to people that we are actually doing something about crime and we're reducing crime rates. I.e., you likely to enact short-term policies which deliver outcomes immediately, right? So policies which have immediate outcomes are prioritized over policies which do not get these immediate outcomes. We think in terms of social policies that are enacted, you get worse policies on your side of the house. So Ashish, we talk about uncertain policies and risky projects, right? We think on your side of the house, policies like microfinance are often unlikely to be supported by a lot of these private investors, or risky innovative projects are not going to be supported, right? Because often the return on these investments is extremely uncertain, and there's a lesser chance of making profit in these cases. So we think on the comparative, when the government is not constantly beholden to this profit, they're likely to invest more in these projects. We think even then we do better. Finally, only causes that can be quantified and measured will be supported. Before I go on, okay. Sure.
Right. You seem to be making an argument against the concept of investment itself, because all investments might fail. Why do people say invest in startups, which fail 90% of the time?
No, sure. So I'm just making a comparative argument, right? So when you claim that these private investors are constantly likely to fund risky projects, we think like that's an unlikely scenario, right? We think when the governments are not beholden to profit, when they feel that there is a greater social need that they want to support, we think compared to private investors, these governments have greater incentive to put money into risky projects because they no longer beholden to delivering short-term outcomes for private investors. We think on the comparative, these private investors have a lesser incentive to do this. Finally, only causes that can be quantified. Often investors care about tangible returns and often analyze investments by placing numbers on these outcomes. So only causes that you can quantify and tangibly measure outcomes for are prioritized. For example, you can place numbers on things like crime or education, but often causes like rights or social movements. When they talk about developing countries, so things like rights for women in developing countries are not things you can actually quantify and measure. So we think investors do not have an incentive to fund these sorts of causes where you can't tangibly measure or quantify, place a number on the kind of social outcomes you achieve. We think in these instances, they actually prioritize causes which can only be measured. We think you skew investments, and for all these reasons, we think governments are better actors. Extremely proud of those.
Thank you very much to the member of the opposition. Government Whip, take it away.
So roughly two ideas I'd like to talk about. Firstly, innovation, and secondly, efficacy. So firstly, innovation. So a main contention that closing opposition had in our case was that firms will only want to invest in short-term bonds. So that's simply not true. Firstly, we can have longer bond periods, which means that if they want to buy this bond, they have to buy it up to 20 years, for instance. And let's just say that firms do have a huge incentive to invest in bonds over a long period, because it means that a longer period, their social outcomes are extremely risky and indefinite to actually materialize. We think that firms would definitely want to invest in bonds for longer periods. We think a second alternative is that we have roll-up bonds, which means that bonds that happen in phases. For instance, every 5 years, you have to pay for the bond. We think that this does mean that this does give firms an incentive to invest in these types of bonds, because these bonds do mean that the greater return when it comes to the risk appetite. They're telling us that actually governments are always better alternatives, because firms only want to invest in policies where there are definite returns. Let us point out to you that in the context of this debate, in risky pilot social projects, there are actually no pilot projects that have definite returns, because they are pilot projects, which means that there's no precedent, there's no empirical evidence to tell you that this project will definitely succeed. The only reason why the government has incentive to give these bonds to private firms is because there are no definite returns, which means that you are going to have projects like building public roads as a social pilot project. You're going to have things like restorative justice, rehabilitation schemes as pilot projects. So there's a 52% chance of success. But the government isn't willing to invest in these projects, so they're not sure whether the cost will actually materialize in real outcomes. But why is it the case that firms have a huge incentive to invest in projects even if they're risky? We tell you that firms, unlike governments, have an extremely diverse portfolio, which means that not only do they invest in very stable projects, they also invest in very risky projects, because the greater the risk, the higher the return. That is why extremely huge firms also invest in extremely risky projects like startups. You see MNCs investing in very small startups all the time, because even if it's risky, it could mean huge benefits for them. Yes, sir.
Let's assume New York's privately funded prison experiment fails. What is to stop companies from passing on the cost of failed investment to the taxpayer by charging more for private prison services?
Wait, what? We think that if the private project fails, it means that you actually do not incur any social costs because you aren't using taxpayers' money. We think it's a good idea that you're getting these private firms who are doing these prisons to actually pay for the cost. And we don't think it's true that these private prisons can just directly move the cost to society, because there are always limits between the contract between the government and these private firms, which means you can't just randomly increase the cost and move it to taxpayers. We think that one is ridiculous. But moreover, they're also telling us that, firms will want to do things like go to impoverished areas because returns are definitely going to materialize. Well, firstly, we point out to you that these returns are artificial, which means that even if we go to an impoverished area, you don't see any immediate returns on profits. But the government is the one who's going to attach a material profit to whatever social outcome you want to see in an impoverished area. An example to illustrate this is, for instance, if the government wants a company to build schools in an impoverished area, the outcome could be, it wants to go to build schools and 50% of all the students match pass the national exam, then I'll give you this amount of money. The harder the project, the higher the return will be, which means that in impoverished areas, where I'm assuming they need that project that's going to be extremely risky, extremely difficult to materialize, governments actually offer higher returns. There will definitely be certain firms which are huge firms, such as bigger risk appetites, who will want to invest in these projects. These are projects where, if not for private funding, governments would never have an opportunity to invest in. So here's a comparison. Without private funding, these projects will never ever materialize, precisely because our pilot projects are extremely hard to pass on in public, because no one will think that these projects will have very definite returns. People only want to invest in projects where you can definitely ensure social outcomes so that their voters want to vote for them in the next election. It's only with private funding that some projects that private funders think will be successful will then be enacted. If it fails, then at least it's no cost to society because I'm not using taxpayers' money. If it succeeds, it means more money in the future because now the public sector with empirical evidence to prove that I can now use my public funding to actually invest in these pilot projects and continue them. We think it's great to have private funding for innovation. Moving to the next idea on efficacy. We actually put together arguments that it's only when you allow private funding, they actually decrease the rate of failure and increase efficacy. Why is this so? Because when you have private funders and private investors, this is when the government is accountable to these private investors. This means that these investors will always be having analysts to be constantly monitoring and watching out for the success of these projects. And this does mean that the government now has to be accountable to these investors, as opposed to a public project where there's no private funding. I think it's often the case that governments don't necessarily have the hugest incentive to ensure the success of these projects. Well, of course, you want to try their best to ensure that the project successful so they can show the electorate that it is good. But on the occasion that it does fail, they can simply hide it. But in this case, you can't hide it because the private investors are always in the know of what exactly they're doing. Because in this case, they're directly giving money to the government to carry out these projects. This does mean that the government, on our side, governments have a huge incentive to ensure accountability, transparency, and success. They're telling us that we're actually very difficult to measure the amount of return that's proportional to what exactly the social outcomes are. So that's not really the case. For instance, an issue that probably a lot of people will think is extremely nebulous to measure would focus on the welfare of women. But we do think there are many tangible indicators that you can tag, that you can actually peg to these issues. For instance, employment rates of women, the rate of childbirth of women,
the rate of education, literacy and education of these women. I think that all of these are very tangible indicators that can be used to measure whether you're actually having successful social outcomes. And hence you tag them out in return the degree of success of these outcomes. But lastly, what these ideas are never rebutted by closing opposition, which is that private funding is actually a very good fiscal alternative to privatization. Because in this case, they're going to be able to cut costs, but at the same time, don't have to resort to privatization. Why exactly is privatization so bad? For instance, they're going to privatize prisons. It actually means that you don't actually get cut costs at the end of the day. It means that prisons have the huge self-interested incentive to ensure that they take in more prisoners, to take in more prisoners and keep them for a longer period of time in the prison so they can earn more profits. We think that the profit-motivated incentive actually ensures that governments don't manage to cut costs. Privatization becomes a drainage of money and resources for the government. We think that our policy is a perfect alternative that does ensure the cutting down of costs and does also ensure the success of social outcomes in today's world. For all these reasons, please go with closing up.
Thank you very much to the government whip. We now invite the last speaker for the debate, the opposition whip, to sum up the debate for the first opposition.
Mr. Speaker, today we are debating about tying up social issues with economic profit. And in this context, I am here to show you why the opposition's case is more sustainable in this manner, because we believe that the case put forward by the government is not sustainable in the long run, and also it is skewing up the priority that we place over different social issues to be tackled within the country. And through the course of my speech, I will tell you why you should go with closing opposition for this case. To begin with, the closing government painted a picture wherein we need more innovative solutions to tackle social issues. We believe that in this particular solution proposed, while the risk of failure is borne by taxpayers, we have to understand that once first of all, taxpayers are likely to choose schemes which show more promise in terms of generating return, which will kind of skew up the kind of schemes that get more monetary investment, which will change the focus of the government. And we believe that social issues should be prioritized based on government's interest, the government's perceptions of people's interest, because we believe that it is more representative. It is more representative of the people's needs of the country rather than a group of private investors. Furthermore, when the private investors buy the risk of failure in social issues, there is more possibility that in the long run, in case there are social issues in which a lot of money needs to be pulled in and the bonds do not necessarily return a lot of give good returns on investments, private investors will stop investing in those bonds, and that will lead to those social issues losing priority, which is completely against the interest of the whole country. No, thank you, sir. We do acknowledge that the closing government told us that we could have long-term bonds which could tackle this problem, but we believe that even if there are long-term bonds, this is not going to get solved, because a lot of the issues that we're talking about is not just an issue which is hard to tackle, but also an issue hard to quantify, and that means that we are in this system where it is really hard for us to quantify the results that we have and then convert it to monetary profit, which might result in private investors not really investing in these bonds, and that could lead to that could just skew up the whole system that we have in place. Then another point that the government put forward was that the market chooses which schemes work, and basically that's exactly what our problem is. The market, based on the return in investment, chooses which schemes to pull more money in, and that we believe is not a correct strategy to handle social issues, because they in nature we believe that it's social issues. No, thank you, sir. We believe that social issues should not be reduced to a game of numbers wherein we look at profit and decide on which to invest in more, and we don't want that circle of issues to happen. So we believe that the solution that the governments are trying to put forward here, in terms of having private investor funding is not necessarily sustainable in the long run, and we believe that there is a perfectly viable alternative, which is exactly the status quo. We believe that the current way in which the government functions, where the government chooses what social issues to prioritize and actually pulls money in, is a better thing to do than having private funding, because we believe that it is more sustainable in the long run, and issues do not get skewed based on the amount of revenue that they generate. Why do we believe so? Let me quickly summarize the case that the closing opposition put forth. The first thing that we tried to tell you was that the government is going to focus more on delivery when it comes to these bonds, because and we are not really sure whether it's such a good thing to focus a lot on delivery. Because while it is good to have goals, if there is while it is good to have goals, when there is pressure on the government to actually show results to the investors, that leads to cost cutting, and that is definitely not something we want to see in solutions put forward for social issues, because we believe that social issues should not be tried to solve with profit in mind, and hence we believe that this will also lead to the government focusing more on short-term outcomes rather than long-term outcomes, and that we believe is against the whole concept of social work, and we believe that it is better to leave the status quo as it is instead of getting into this particular model put forth by the government. The next thing that we talked about is how social issues prioritization gets skewed in the model that the government puts forth, and in this case, investors. Yes, ma'am.
In our world, the governments do get to choose social priorities. It's just that they get to fund innovative solutions that are happening only for the first time.
Thank you, ma'am. What I'm trying to say is, while the government does choose what projects it puts forth on the table, it's the investors who actually choose which to fund. And when that happens a lot, there is a very good chance that certain projects which need to be undertaken, even though they might not succeed, for the sake of social good, like for example, the social work. For example, it's really hard to quantify women's rights outcomes in India and India or other such developing countries, and in that case we believe that a lot of issues which need to be focused on could be left out, and that we believe is not the way in which we should strategize our approach to solving social issues. Yeah, so continuing on how I talked about social issues being prioritized in a wrong fashion, because we believe that the private investors are not the perfect agency to decide what's important and what's not. We believe that the government is more representative of people's needs and is in a better position to choose how to pool the money that it has into various social issues. And furthermore, the final point that we talked about was that social issues can't be quantified as returns, and how social issues should not really be tried to solve with profit in mind. And we talked about how status quo is way better than the potential problems that could result out of the model that the government has proposed, which is to have a sort of bonds which channel private investor funding into social issues. We believe that existing schemes like CSR and tax is a way better thing to do, just because we believe that the government is in a better position to choose where to put money into. And for all these reasons, I'm very proud of those.
Shaking hands? Okay, I see. Okay.